I said, today I'm going to get into and I'm going to talk about the rise of capitalism in the United States, so-called age of industry, which really takes off after the American Civil War. So get into that because you don't really have any corporations much or companies we know of that are really before the Civil War, not too much. And of course, it's going to lead to the rise of big business, the so-called capitalists, captains of industry that kind of come in and kind of start developing things in the country. And of course, they're known as, like I said, the robber barons, is what a lot of people, of course, refer to them as pretty much. Let me go ahead, of course. Last lecture, of course, I had finished up talking about the Old West. Of course, now, like I said, I'll be moving on to talk about the rise of the robber barons and all that, and so-called capitalism in America. And before if you go back to before the Civil War, they didn't have all these big companies and corporations like you think of. I think one of the first corporations to form in American history was actually Western Union, that dealt with like telegraph lines and all that. They do much with telegraphs anymore. They send money and things like that. But that was considered one of the first corporations that was founded in America. They did have like joint stock companies and things like that that did exist also as well. And most of it happens after the Civil War. That's when you start seeing, like I said, the consolidation of these big, large-sized companies that start coming out, corporations that really kind of start replacing a lot of the smaller type businesses. And previously, a lot of businesses, of course, were owned like by families, like mom and pop type operations overall, like usually family-owned towns even, or factories that they had that they ran. And so that's the kind of things that you saw, I think, prior to really the development of capitalism in the United States with the so-called American Industrial Revolution that occurs in the 1800s. Okay, coming back in. Okay, but so anyway, of course, they talked about in the video how, these different people that came in, these captains of industry that started everything, they were later called robber barons. These were like the geniuses that were the early capitalists that really started, like Standard Oil, Carnegie Steel Company, and all these other companies that would rise up. And a lot of them were actually from impoverished means, which is, of course, true about, if you think about what they really were. So I'll get to them later, but, you had famous men like Carnegie, Rockefeller, Vanderbilt, J.P. Morgan. Those are all famous robber barons that will be well known, that developed a lot of different industries, more or less. Iron, steel industries, shipping, banks, railroads, things like that. Those are things, of course, that, will be developed later. Oil petroleum industry, of course, was also developed as well. I know they're given bad names, the robber barons and all that, but they do, of course, they do kind of give their money away, which is true. That's one thing. Like Andrew Carnegie gave away like something like $300 million to different charities in general. So they weren't known for being so-called philanthropists, but they were also known for their showy wealth. Like the Vanderbilts, were known for building these lavish mansions. Like you may have heard of the Breakers in Newport, Rhode Island, or I don't know if you've ever been to the Biltmore estate, which is in Asheville, North Carolina. That, of course, is a good example of what they call conspicuous consumption, where they would kind of show off their wealth to everybody. So we'll talk more about the robber barons later, but they, of course, were known for all that. All right, so anyway, I'm going to go ahead and first talk about, believe it or not, the food industry. That's one area in capitalism in America that really took off, believe it or not. And like especially around the Civil War, it was one of the first areas that really industrialized, besides like railroads in general. And The reason why the food industry was important was because the fact that basically people needed food during the Civil War, like to feed the soldiers. They needed milk, things like that. And so that's part of why various industries in the food industry had to industrialize, like around 1860s or whatever. And so I usually talk about an example of one that was real famous that really came out that was considered one of the first to really start industrializing in the food industry. That was Gail Borden, you may have heard of. You're at Borden's Milk and all that, right? Which is still around today. Borden, of course, who I believe was from New York, had moved to Texas. And milk was kind of popular. Like a lot of the Civil War troops needed it. And so he formed this company that eventually came up with what is called condensed milk, which I think was developed in the 1850s, right before the war. They didn't have pasteurization yet at this point with milk. And so this is a way to like can milk, and then people could consume it, basically. And so it was an important milk product that a lot of troops, of course, would later use during the war. Also, you had evaporated milk that would also be developed as well. And Borden went on, of course, to make a lot of products out of milk, and so on. They got a pretty good onion dip that's pretty good, I like, today. But yeah, they're of course known for that, of course. And yeah, I think the dairy industry is kind of struggling today, I know. But milk is still, the best thing really to drink that's healthy for you, I think. Also, you've got as well H.J. Heinz. You may have heard of Heinz, of course, very famous for his, ketchup. Everybody's heard of ketchup and all that. Heinz started in Pennsylvania, Pittsburgh, of course, and Heinz actually started out not with ketchup, but actually with canning, like vegetables. So that was something that they started doing a lot, which, if you're living out in the country, the best way to, have food is to can things, vegetables, fruit, etc. And so that was something he started doing on a mass scale. And then, of course, later he started, of course, developing condiments like ketchup and all that. And so he's also known, of course, the company's also known for that as well, more like a corporation, I guess, today, really. So that's another example of a type of, industry that was basically something that did that. Now, they also got the meat packing industry. I did want to kind of get into and talk about that. The meat packing industry was another industry that really got going with industrializing in the 1800s as well. That was because of the popularity of meat, especially beef, like in Texas, which was being shipped to different markets. And so Chicago and other cities started, building these meat packing plants, which, by the way, were heavily influenced, like how they took apart animals, was kind of influenced by the Native Americans, which would use, every part of the animal, if you know about this. And so there were two men that were involved in doing this. It was like Philip Armour, of course, was one of the first. I believe I've got a picture of Armour somewhere. I thought I had. There he is right there, Philip Armour. Armour was considered the man that really began the whole meat packing industry. He was considered the one that invented the so-called disassembly line, where they would basically take apart every part of the animal and use it, for making different products. And it was a famous saying that he said once that he made money on every part of the pig, but it squealed. And he said he was working on it. So yeah, you can see all the things that they made out of it: dressed beef, meat canning, glue manufacturing, fertilizer, margarine, hairbrushes, buttons. So they used basically the whole hog, other animals to make things out of it. So that's something, of course, you start seeing, of course, in a lot of industries in America. Also, you also see too, like I said this before here, but there was another guy named Gustavus Swift, who was also very famous in the meat packing, the so-called House of Swift, they called it. Both of them are around still. Swift and Armour are still, their products are still around, making, different kinds of meat products, etc. But Swift was the one that founded also the first way to ship like food, ice-cooled railroad cars. So he had those refrigerated cars, of course. And so that was a way basically to get things to the market in different parts of the country. Although some people complained, by the way, that some of his beef was embalmed. And House of Swift, as they called it, had like at least 15,000 workers. I believe Swift was the one that made more money than Armour, believe it or not. You can see at his death, he was worth $250 million from his development of his meat packing industry. You can see there with Swift, they butchered on average 2 million cattle a year, 4 million hogs, and 2 million sheep. That's a lot of animals. And imagine what it is now today. Here's a picture, of course, one of the refrigerator cars, of course, that they would ship food products, of course. And of course, later they would ship, like fruit and other vegetables and things like that would also be shipped, of course, in cars like that, trucks later as well. The only thing about the meat packing industry that's kind of bad, is that later on, they had all these lack of regulations that were real kind of health issues. And a lot of this would not be uncovered until the early 1900s, when Upton Sinclair wrote a book about it called The Jungle. And under Teddy Roosevelt's administration, they would make a bunch of reforms where they would create the Food and Drug Administration. The Meat Inspection Act came out, where the USDA started inspecting meat and things like that. And so that's something that really, was important later. Also, another thing that kind of came out of we study about this period as well, people across the country wanted like different products shipped to their house. So you had at first like Sears and Roebuck, Montgomery Ward, had these mail order companies where you could order stuff and then they could ship it to you, like by a railroad or whatever. So you had that. Then you had like chain stores like Woolworth, Macy's, that came later as well. Those were considered some of the first companies that sold people products and all that. A lot of them started like in catalogs where people would just order stuff out of it and ship it to people. So that's something you start seeing too, throughout the country, that starts kind of conglomerating as well. Right, then you've got, of course, the famous robber barons, of course, that I want to get into today and get to. Of course, I did want to talk about some of the early robber barons, of course, that were big in the country, that were, the so-called capitalists, captains of industry, that were real big. And one of the first that you see that comes in that's real important is Cornelius Vanderbilt, who was, of course, affectionately called the Commodore. The Commodore was very famous for being really considered one of the first big industrialists. He was considered like an early robber baron in American history. He's one of the first millionaires, by the way, as well. A lot of them came from poverty. That's one of the things about a lot of the early robber barons. Most of them were, I think, came from poverty, except for J.P. Morgan, who I think was not. But you can see there, let me blow this up. You can see that he was born in 1794 in New York, came from an impoverished, family overall. But when he was a teenager, he came up with this idea to start a kind of a shipping company, which was more like a ferry system, pretty much, between New York City and Staten Island. And so what happened over time was that Vanderbilt eventually became like a kind of one of the first industrialists to kind of start building a lot of steamships in the country. It's like a steam shipping industry. And so that basically is where he got his nickname. And then from there, he also, got into railroads. as well, because he ended up being, one of the first railroad tycoons that would kind of come to power over time. And he had different railroads. The most famous was the New York Central Railroad that he developed and controlled overall. And you can see he was also known for a few other things that were famous later. Vanderbilt was basically famous for also being a philanthropist, giving away a lot of his money. He was known for founding Vanderbilt University, which is in, of course, Nashville, Tennessee, which he spent about $1 million to develop it at that time. So he was kind of known for all of those kind of things overall. I mentioned this before, but the Vanderbilts were famous for all their showy mansions, which was a form of conspicuous consumption. And I tell you about those two mansions, the Breakers, the Biltmore. Those two mansions, of course, were some of the later Vanderbilts were kind of known for, of course, doing. But you can see he was kind of a pretty honest guy. He was kind of ruthless, as a businessman, but he was kind of more honest reputation compared to some of the later ones, which were not. Some of the later robber barons were kind of sometimes dishonest about their reputations and things like that. Then they have, of course, one they talked about, of course, in the video, which was Andrew Carnegie. I think they mentioned him a little bit as one of the main industrialists that, of course, was very famous. I do have a video on Carnegie that I'll show you a little bit about him. So let me go ahead and do that real quick about his life.
And now, a page from our Sunday Morning Almanac, November 25th, 1835, 183 years ago today, the day Andrew Carnegie was born in Scotland. At age 13, Carnegie moved to the U.S., settling outside Pittsburgh, where he was immediately put to work in a factory. Through diligence and hard work, Carnegie lifted himself up to become the biggest steel manufacturer in the land, which also made him one of the richest men in the land, worth twice as much as Bill Gates in today's dollars. After selling his business to financier J.P. Morgan in 1901, Carnegie devoted himself to charity, as outlined in his book, The Gospel of Wealth, which he read out loud in this early, scratchy recording.
The millionaire will be but a trustee for the poor, entrusted for a season with a part of the increased wealth of the community, but administering it for the community.
Andrew Carnegie put his words into deeds, endowing more than 2,500 public libraries worldwide, more than 1,600 in the U.S. alone. And although he died in 1919 at the age of 83, his name lives on at Carnegie Mellon University in Pittsburgh, at his famous music hall in New York, and at charitable institutions such as the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. As for the differing pronunciations of his last name, well, we'll let the people of his hometown in Scotland have the final word.
Carnegie.
Andrew Carnegie.
Carnegie.
Andrew Carnegie.
So there you go, right there, Andrew Carnegie. I guess they say it right. So anyway, Carnegie, of course, I always say in the West, I guess in America. So he basically, was from Scotland. Originally came over, of course, here to America. Pittsburgh, of course, so-called capital of steel, of course, is where he would, of course, develop his industry. Carnegie was known for developing what they call the Bessemer process, which, of course, was developed in England by this man named Henry Bessemer. And so he would use that process where they would take, raw pig iron and make it into like steel, which is carbonized iron. And so he, began to use this massive industry to control, the steel industry overall. And like I said, Pittsburgh, became later the central capital of the steel industry, especially in the 20th century. It would, at least up to the 1960s and 70s, it was at one point. And so Pittsburgh has often been called the so-called Steel City today. That's why you have the Pittsburgh Steelers, in the NFL. He later, of course, sold it to J.P. Morgan. I forget the amount it was, but it was a good bit. I think it was $480 million is how much he actually sold it for, his company. They created U.S. Steel out of it, which was one of the first billion-dollar corporations that was created. And then they talked about how the fact that he gave a lot of his wealth away. I think he gave away something like $350 million of his wealth away. That's ridiculous, the amount of money he gave away, which they talked about the fact that he created a bunch like schools. They were created like the Carnegie Mellon University, of course, as example. And he founded, of course, a bunch of, libraries all over the country as well. And he did all this because through that whole method they talked about in that short video, which was vertical integration, where he basically controlled the whole industry from beginning to end, from the coal mines to the railroads to the steel mills. He controlled pretty much everything, the method of it. And so that's how he was able to monopolize it, which later led to, of course, steel. Vanderbilt was from New York. So he was born in America. Carnegie, if you want to say it that way, of course, was from Scotland, and he immigrated to the United States. All right, so yeah, talking about those, of course, those robber barons. Now, the one that they always talk about, which of course I'll be getting into next, which is even there's of course, by the way, a furnace, one of those Bessemer furnaces that they, of course, made back in the 19th century, which would convert pig iron into steel. They usually call it a Bessemer furnace, or it's called a steel furnace. And he would kind of borrow that process in America and bring it over here. I think this picture here, there, of course, a famous quote he said. There was a quote he said that was famous. He said, "I started life as a poor man, and I wish to end it that way." He didn't want to die a rich man. He wanted to give his wealth away and help out the impoverished, basically. But you can see here how that's how a lot of these companies like that, like Carnegie Steel, would control everything from mining all the way down to the refining of steel and so on, rolling of steel. You can see they pretty much control the process of it. Now, I will be getting into, and I will be talking about, of course, the next thing that's petroleum, oil industry, of course, is the next big industry that's pretty important. The oil industry began in the 1860s, like just maybe close around the Civil War. And what happened was oil was discovered in Pennsylvania, a place called Titusville. And there was this man named Edwin Drake. He was one of the first to build an oil well in the United States. And of course, at first, people made fun of Drake. They called it Drake's Folly because they thought he wouldn't get anything. And when he struck oil, that in 1859, basically that the people realized that oil industry was another industry that could obviously be developed. There was a man named Benjamin Silliman who was a professor at one of the Ivy League schools. He was a chemist. He kind of was one of the first to take petroleum in America and make kerosene out of it, other products. And so basically they realized that they could use it for different fuels, like in lanterns and so on. And eventually what's going to happen is that kerosene will replace whale oil from whales, which had been pretty much used as a fuel, like in lanterns for a long time, up to the 1800s. So kind of whaling will kind of decline because of that, because that was why people get whaling, to get the whale oil, that and perfume from ambergris, about that. But Standard Oil, of course, is what is the big thing, of course, that will come in next. That's going to be important. With, of course, John D. Rockefeller. Rockefeller, of course, was considered, the founder of the Standard Oil Company, which was founded, by the way, in Cleveland, Ohio, in 1870. And it was one of the first business trusts that kind of comes around and starts to really dominate this particular industry. And Rockefeller would dominate the whole thing. He would control the production of oil. He would control the refining of it, the transportation of the oil and selling of it, like gasoline and all that later as well. And Standard Oil was able to develop itself into a trust because of the horizontal integration that they talked about in the short video at the beginning of this lecture. And basically, they would control a strategic aspect of the oil industry, which happened to be, by the way, refining. Refining is the most important key aspect, of course, still in the oil industry today. It's great if you got oil, but if you can't make it out of something, it's worthless. So that's something he kind of started developing. And so in different parts of the country, different states and so on, he began buying up all the different oil companies that, made different products out of it. And so from there, he was able to monopolize or form a trust, which I think he had 90% of the industry was controlled by Rockefeller at one point. Eventually, it was broken up, though. You know about this. In 1911, Standard Oil of New Jersey versus the United States, Supreme Court case, Standard Oil was actually broken up. It was broken up into 34 different corporations. It's not only as you know today. Exxon, later ExxonMobil, Shell, Gulf, Chevron, Texaco, any of those you name, it was at one point part of Standard Oil. And so all these were kind of, broken up into different ones because of the fact that it was such a monopoly in the country. And that's happened quite a lot where different companies have been broken up numerous times in the past. We'll talk about, it's because of the Sherman Antitrust Act, the Clayton Antitrust Act, acts like that kind of ban monopolies or trusts in the United States. Here's some other images. Of course, some people joke that Standard Oil was the big octopus, controlling different things, not just the different industries like in oil or whatever, but also controlling things politically because of its, power in general. So some people joked about that it was this huge octopus, like that little cartoon that you're kind of looking at. Later on, he was brought down. I'll talk about later. Ida Tarbell, was a famous muckraker. You've heard about her later. She brings down Standard Oil with her famous book, History of the Standard Oil Company, and it will be broken up later under the, I think it's under the Taft administration, when, of course, that occurs. Standard Oil also, you look at here's, of course, some more history of Standard Oil. You can see Exxon was sometimes called Standard or Esso, of course, the other name that they called it. But this basically shows the difference between the vertical and the horizontal integration. You can see here that Rockefeller was able to control the whole thing because of refining right here. And then from there, because he controlled refining, he was able to control everything else: oil fields, oil storage facilities, barrel factories, pipelines, railroad tanker cars, I guess later gas stations and all that too as well. So that's how they basically did it. And of course, it was kind of done in unscrupulous kind of ways, which was true about some of these capitalists, of course, that were that powerful. By the way, Rockefeller at one point was one of the most wealthy men in the world. I forget how wealthy it was, but it was like he was worth billions in today's money. He was a billionaire, So anyway, I'm going to also talk about as well J.P. Morgan. He's another one I did want to mention about. He was also very famous in some of the early capitalists. He's big as well. J.P. Morgan, was into all kinds of things. He was a financier on Wall Street. He was a banker. Like you may have heard of Chase Manhattan Bank, right? Of course, he pretty much controlled that pretty much where my mortgage is. And railroads, he was into steel industry, the U.S. Steel, electric industries. So J.P. Morgan was basically everywhere. He was a billionaire too, also as well. But he came from, of course, more wealthy backgrounds. Wasn't like poor like the other guys. But you can see he was also engaged in a lot of illegal practices as well. And so some of his monopolies or trusts were also broken up as well. They were. I think one of them was the Northern Securities Company, I think under Teddy Roosevelt was broken up too. Under Teddy Roosevelt's administration, which was a railroad trust. So he had his hand everywhere, J.P. Morgan. And of course, Chase Manhattan Bank is one of the most famous things that, of course, he helped establish. All right. Also, I want to get into next, and I did want to talk about one thing that's famous, I guess, about the 19th century is you have the development of a lot of different famous American inventors, entrepreneurs that kind of affect American capitalism. They were kind of in the Industrial Revolution that helped to kind of industrialize America and other countries. And I'll kind of go back to before the Civil War a little bit. I'll go kind of before that and mostly talk about the late 19th century, primarily the ones that were famous overall. One that was the first that I did want to talk about is McCormick. You've heard of Cyrus McCormick. He was, of course, was well known overall. McCormick was the one who founded what they called later the International Harvester Company. That's what they dub it today. And he developed some of the first mechanical reapers, like the cut grain, which were drawn by horses. So he was kind of important. His company was based in Chicago, and you can see they began to build a lot of these, like 10,000 or more were being built. And then over time, it's going to eventually be, types of machines that are powered by, gas engines, diesel engines in the future. So McCormick was very vital in that area. And it's still around. The IHC, International Harvester Company, is one of those companies that's kind of rivaled up there with John Deere, et cetera, Kubota, other companies that do the same thing also as well. Also, you got, of course, Samuel B. Morse as well. He's important as well. I think he was on that same one right here. But he's the one who developed the telegraph. That's well known. He, of course, developed the Morse code, which was a series of dots and dashes where they would send electric pulses to send messages. And he actually sent one of the first messages by telegraph in 1844, which was, by the way, like a saying from the Bible, which was, "What has God wrought?" And so that became very popular in America afterwards. And so by the Civil War, they started using telegraph lines a lot for telecommunications. And the telegraph was the early form of like telecommunications before you had the phone and wireless telegraph and so on. So before that, you wanted to send somebody a message, you had to mail a letter or something like that, or send a message to somebody, maybe by horseback or whatever. And it took forever. So that's basically, of course, Samuel B. Morse right there. Also, you had a lot of other types of telecommunications that were big in America, besides the so-called telegraph right there. You had also Alexander Graham Bell. He was one of the first, of course, to patent the telephone in 1876. Bell came from Britain originally. He migrated to Canada and he ended up in Philadelphia. And anyway, he formed his own company later, which patented the first telephone, which was called the Bell Telephone Company. And the Bell Telephone Company was one of the first companies to basically monopolize the telephone industry. They also had Cyrus W. Field. He was very famous. He was an American that was one of the first to lay the first transatlantic cable, which connected the United States with Britain. So you had a case where you have different countries trying to connect each other to telecommunicate with each other, and with telegraph lines initially. And so that's something that Field did that was very famous also as well. You may have heard of Marconi as well. He came from Italy, so-called Marconi Telegraph Company. He founded. He was one of the first to experiment with wireless telegraph, where they used like wireless radio, where they sent radio waves as for messages or whatever. And so he was known for that. And so Marconi Telegraph Company was a rival company to, say, Western Union. That was one of the first to dominate, like I said, the telegraph industry overall. So you can see later they have like the radios developed in the early 1900s, where these people listen to music news. The television is developed in the 1920s, believe it or not, was. And so those are different things that are kind of developed later in American history that are kind of important for later. Also, you may have heard of John Deere. He's of course important as well. Deere was instrumental in developing the first iron and then later steel plows, like manufacturing them in a large amount. So he started his own company that became very famous in American history, which is John Deere, the John Deere Company, which is still around today, famous for their green tractors, right, as a whole. And so he's pretty important in developing a lot of farm implements to make farming a lot easier, for farmers in general. So got the John Deere plow, came out in 1837, of course, which you can see there. Also, you've got Charles Goodyear, who's important as well. He was important in American history, developing the first vulcanized rubber for like tires and things like that. Most things out of rubber were made from the rubber plant originally, and then over time they began to develop more synthetic, rubber, starts to be developed also as well. And so he would create his own company to do that, which was, of course, called Goodyear. So called Goodyear Tire Company, which is like, all these different tire companies, Firestone, Yokohama, and so on that you've got today. That was one of the first, of course, to do that. That's famous. So-called rubber. So back 1840s, when Charles Goodyear, got started pretty much. You may have heard of Elijah Otis. He's also famous too. Otis is the one that developed some of the first elevators, escalators that were used in buildings to bring people up to different, floors in buildings. And, without that, without escalators, especially without elevators, skyscrapers wouldn't be possible. Who would want to run up 100 flight of stairs, right? More or less. And so that's something he was kind of known for. That was very famous. He also made the first elevators that had some kind of emergency brake with it if it fell from a high level. And so he, of course, did that, which was very famous. Oh, another one who's I'll kind of throw in there too, who's famous, is John Roebling. He was an American engineer. He was one of the first to develop a steel wire suspension bridge, which you see there was built in the 1860s, which is the Brooklyn Bridge. And the Brooklyn Bridge built the New York City bridge basically from what is, Manhattan in New York to what is Brooklyn. That's considered one of the types of bridges in the world that was copied by other people. Like other companies kind of copy that and build bridges similar to that. Like the Golden Gate Bridge, I guess, kind of similar to that, that you have later, built in the 20th century. So bridges like that start to be built, of course, sometime after the American Civil War. Here's something you don't think about, but the typewriter was something that was developed in the 1870s, which of course Christopher Sholes. Of course, people don't use typewriters much anymore, but one thing that he is famous for today now, the keyboard, like the way the keyboard is and the way you type the keys and all that is all something he developed originally back in the 1870s, the so-called QWERTY, keyboard. I always wonder why he put it in that order, QWERTY, but I guess he did. So that influenced a lot of things like with computers, cell phones, and other things where you type up stuff and so on. And so you can see he sold his prototype to Remington, which was, I guess, built the first mass-produced typewriters and all that. And so you see it today with computers and all that. Pretty much everybody's got a keyboard with their computers and all that. So he obviously had an influence on that, like I said. Also, of course, very influential, of course, man, you talk about as well during, American history, like in the late 19th, early 20th century. Of course, we got Alexander Graham Bell. There, of course, is a picture you can see him developing the telephone right there. And he and Thomas Watson were the ones that actually developed it. And I don't know if you heard about the story about Alexander Graham Bell, about how they were I think they have a story about the first conversation that they ever had about the telephone. They were kind of experimenting in his lab with Watson, and what happened was Bell spilled some acid on himself, and so he got on the phone. He said, "Watson, come here, I need you." That's what he told him. So Watson heard him and went in there and tried to help him, except he had burned himself. And so that was the first conversation that ever happened with a telephone. Edison, of course, was very prolific as an inventor in American history. If you hear about that, he, of course, is considered one of the most famous to invent the most patents, like something like over 1,300 patents were developed by him. He and his scientists and workshop inventors. And Edison was often called the Wizard of Menlo Park because he had this inventor's factory that he had in Menlo Park, New Jersey. And of course, a lot of his patents, changed people's lives, advanced, technology and the way culture is later in America. And Edison once remarked that he talked about the fact that when he invented something, he talked about the fact that it was like say, I didn't invent the battery, or I didn't invent the light bulb. I just invented ways not to invent the light bulb. Or he said also that his inventions were 99% inspiration, 1% 99% inspiration. It's 99% perspiration, 1% inspiration. Get that mixed up. That's basically saying that's a lot of hard work, basically, to invent these inventions. And of course, people thought that they were basically just made out of magic, wizardry, whatever. But they weren't. Of course, the phonograph you see there, invented in 1877 in New Jersey, was considered the first machine that could either record or play music. And actually, in 1877, around that time, he actually recorded the first song, which was "Mary Had a Little Lamb," with him singing it. And supposedly Edison went to France, where he, I think in front of a bunch of scientists, he showed off his machine. They thought there's got to be a ventriloquist in the room. There's no way this thing works, stuff like that, but it did. So, but he was known for all kinds of inventions. Like, of course, the most famous invention he invented was the light bulb. Of course, you've heard about, which is, of course, still around today and used. The movie projector or movie camera was something he invented, which led to the development of Hollywood in the United States and California, where the movie industry took off. He also developed the first movie, which was the Great Train Robbery in the early 1900s. He also founded General Electric as well, which I think was originally called the Edison Electric Company or something like that, but they basically call it General Electric later. Took its name off the company. But he also found the first power company. He had a power company in New York. He even built, like, which is really weird, he built these cement buildings, like houses. I think some kind of cement company he had, and they built like what they call Edison cement with it, just kind of unique. So yeah, I've got some other pictures showing like some of the stuff Edison did as well. Yeah, there's the so-called light bulb he's known for. Edison Electric, of course, became General Electric, of course, which is still around today, GE. So yeah, New York City, he was able to basically electrify that city. So in the United States, New York City was one of the first to have electricity, lights and things like that. But cities in Europe already had that at the time, but a lot of the lights they used were kind of more dangerous, like arc lights. And so the incandescent light bulb was more practical and more durable. Also, of course, another famous inventor, and he had his company later, which was Kodak. George Eastman, of course, you may have heard of him, which was developed in Rochester, New York. And so he was very, very famous for developing like portable hand cameras, like for photography. And photography was developed actually in France, like early photography, which came to the United States because they were starting to use it around the Civil War. But it's not really until the late 19th century that you start seeing more portable type hand cameras, which are around today that you see. So you have that also as well. Also at the turn of the century, of course, you start seeing people like different cities building subways also as well. 1897, you've got the first subway that's built in Boston, Massachusetts, which connected Boston Harbor to East Boston. So you start seeing that going on. Also, New York, also in 1904, starts building their subway as well. And so all these different major cities will start putting some of their subways underground or above ground in general to move populations around for transportation. So you see a lot of transportation networks being built within cities that are still today overall. But they started already having this, like in Europe, they, I think, started right before them having subways also. Then you've got the so-called Wright brothers I did want to mention about, who were, also part of this period at the turn of the 20th century that come in. The Wright brothers, were the ones that built the first practical airplane. It was flown in 1903. And I don't know if you know much about the Wright brothers, Orville and Wilbur. They were actually bicycle mechanics that owned like a bicycle shop in Ohio. But they heard about gliders, the fact that people were starting to fly early airplanes. And so they wanted to get on the action. And so they started building gliders, building airplanes. And so 1903, they built the first true airplane at that time, which was called the Wright Flyer. They brought it to North Carolina, where they began experimenting with it. I think over several years they kind of worked on it, I know, because it's kind of windy on the east coast of North Carolina. They flew it 1903 at Kitty Hawk, which I think Orville was the one that flew the first airplane. That's going to be important with the airplane because the airplane is going to lead to different, innovations in transportation, commercial industries, also obviously in military changes as well. Within about a 10-year period or so, you even start seeing it being used like in World War I, like in warfare, because of the importance of the airplane. Fighter planes, bombers, things like that. Then commercial aviation will take off later as well. So that's why the Wright brothers are important, of course, with that. Then I did want to mention about Henry Ford as well. Henry Ford also very important as well. He didn't invent the automobile, which is true. The Germans did, like Mercedes-Benz, as you know, was the first company in Germany to start producing automobiles. But Ford was one of the first to begin mass producing automobiles with, interchangeable parts in general near Detroit, Michigan. And his company, which is the Ford Motor Company, which is still around today, was one of the first to mass produce automobiles using some form of assembly line where the workers would produce a certain part of the car, like work on it each. And so his automobiles were more affordable, where they were like, I think the so-called Tin Lizzie or Model T, which they say was one of the first mass-produced cars to come out, was one of the first that was very cheap, cheaply made. I think up to the early 1900s, you could get one for under $1,000, believe it or not. And there was a joke about Ford's like Model T that you get it in any color as long as it's black. Because back in the old days, they just painted cars so they wouldn't rust. So yeah, automobiles are going to be important because it's going to, lead to also further roads being built in the United States. And then you'll also will see, people have more freedom to go wherever they want, in the country rather than having to worry about getting on a train or something like that at the time. All right. I did want to mention also Westinghouse. He's also pretty big as well in the Industrial Revolution. Westinghouse. And Westinghouse was famous for his company called Westinghouse Electric Company, which he incorporated in 1886. It's pretty big because it was one of the companies, by the way, that would revolutionize the development of, like, say, electricity in other fields. And Westinghouse was the one that kind of developed what they call AC technology, which is alternating current, for electricity. I don't know if you know about the late 19th century. They got into what they call the current wars and all that. And if you know about it, Thomas Edison wanted direct current, but Westinghouse, his company, wanted alternating current, AC. So they fought over this. And I guess the guy in the middle that about that was Nikola Tesla. He was kind of this inventor, electrician that was kind of involved with Westinghouse in developing his company. He kind of developed the idea for him. And so that became the main way they have electricity today. Radio, they would control that, and TV. If you know about it, CBS today was actually bought by Westinghouse. If you know about that. They built the first nuclear submarine later on in the 20th century, USS Nautilus. They built the camera that was used to go to the moon. They could take pictures of the moon. By the way, a lot of nuclear power plants were also, of course, built by the Westinghouse Electric Company also as well. It's usually called Westinghouse for short, of course, now. Yeah, there's one that built all the transmission lines and things like that for electricity and stuff like that, which will be kind of important, of course, later. Then you got George Washington Carver. I did want to mention as well, kind of throw him in there too, as someone who's kind of an important entrepreneur and also in agriculture later on that we have. Carver was very famous. He was a scientist in the agricultural field who was at Tuskegee Institute, later called University. And he was important in trying to get farmers to grow other crops. Because if you know about in the South at the time, everybody wanted to grow cotton. But because of the boll weevil epidemic that occurred, other products were kind of needed to be developed and to grow other things. And so he popularized the idea of people growing like peanuts, sweet potatoes, soybeans, which is big here, pecans. My mother's side of the family owns a lot of land out in Point Capee Parish, and they grow a lot of soybeans. Of course, so because of Carver, he popularized the idea of people, growing soybeans in general. He was more known for the peanut, if you know about that, and made peanut butter kind of popular and things like that. I think they often call him Mr. Peanut, if you know about that, George Washington Carver. So he's very famous. A lot of people knew him. He was kind of worldwide known as a scientist and all that. And so he created a lot of innovations, which are still, of course, used today in the agricultural industry overall. So basically, yeah, that's some of the things kind of talking about some of the things that developed in the age of industry at the time, innovations, of course, that will be there. I do have a few minutes. I guess I can kind of talk about a little bit about organized labor. I don't know if I'll be able to finish that today, but I will kind of for a few minutes talk about that also as well. I did want to get into that because we'll probably want to move on later, talk about organized labor, organization of the farmers in America in general. And you study about the age of industry, before that, there weren't really a whole lot of unions and organized labor before the Civil War. There was hardly nothing. It was very little before the Civil War. And average wages, average working conditions of most American workers was pretty poor. Like the workers were awful that some had to live in and work in. And the amount of money that they made was hardly anything. I think the average person, like maybe a skilled laborer, might have made like something like $20 a week. But if you're unskilled, it was more like $10 a week. That's probably 6 days, working 6 days, maybe even 7 days a week also as well. Hardly any time off like we have now. So yeah, no unions, no health insurance, no workers' compensation if you get hurt on the job. They just replace you with somebody else. If you get hurt or if you want to do a strike, they just replace you or something like that. And they think that early unions developed from strikes, believe it or not, in American history. Like these are down here, the railroad strike of 1877. That was considered one of the first strikes in American history that really took place in the United States. Homestead strike, you may have heard of that, which was at one of Carnegie's steel mills. The McCormick strike in 1886, which turned violent with the Knights of Labor. The Pullman strike in 1894, that was another strike that was in Chicago. That was also, McCormick was in Chicago also as well. There were some that were pretty radical before really unions took off. There was one that was called the Molly Maguires. That you may have heard of this group. They made a movie about it with Sean Connery years ago that's well known about it. And the Molly Maguires was this radical, kind of like an early union of miners that were in basically Pennsylvania. They were Irish, who I think came over from Ireland. They were called the Ancient Order of Hibernians, and it was a secret society. Anyway, they turned to violence, using violence basically against the miners owners to get more rights. And so they destroyed mine property. They beat up loyal employees. They even murdered some people as well. They tried to use intimidation to see if they could get more wages and better working conditions. It kind of backfired. And so a lot of mine owners had to bring in like detectives, like the Pinkertons, to basically break it up. Like I think there was a guy named James McParland who was famous for the Pinkerton agency at the time, had to come in and actually break it up. But that was like considered like an early form, which, really didn't work, that kind of thing. But some of the early unions were kind of violent, the way they worked. Of course, you hear about some early types of organized labor in the country that you have. There was one called the Knights of St. Crispin that came out. That was like a union of shoemakers that developed in Wisconsin, but it became more popular up in the Northeast, like your big cities like Philadelphia, I think, where it kind of took off. I know Boston, New York, especially among the Irish, etc. I know, and that was one that was formed. They think right around the Civil War, maybe, but then it took off by the 1870s. They made boots, they made shoes, and There was even a woman's version of the Knights of St. Crispin that was called the Daughters of St. Crispin as well. A lot of these, I think, didn't work. They kind of faded. Then there was another one, of course, that became more well-known. Probably one of the first that's really famous in American history is the Knights of Labor that took off, which happened sometime in the late 19th century. The Knights of Labor was a type of labor union founded in Philadelphia in 1869. Uriah Stevens was believed one of the founders of it, who was a Philadelphian tailor, made clothes. And the Labor Federation was a type of organization that was basically for all workers. That was the whole point of what it was for. However, it was very secretive. They had to keep it a secret that they were, involved with this union, or they would get fired by their employers. And the Knights of Labor was really kind of radical compared to some other ones, of course, that were later. And they wanted to organize by everybody, not just, skilled labor, but unskilled labor, male, female, all different races, black, white, whatever. So they wanted to have one big union for everybody, pretty much. They wanted an 8-hour workday. They favored arbitration or bargaining with employers. So they were one of the first to kind of come up with these ideas, basically as a union. But what happened to them was they became unpopular because of an incident that happened, which was called the Haymarket Riot, or also called the Haymarket Affair, which happened in May of 1886. Anyway, in Chicago, they were doing a strike, some kind of labor demonstration to get an 8-hour workday, which had to do with the McCormick Works, which is later International Harvester Company. They wanted to have an 8-hour workday as the workers, and so they went on strike. However, somebody threw a bomb into the crowd, and it killed some people, including, I think, some police officers died, including some workers. And so they arrested a bunch of people, and they were put on trial, and 4 were hanged for it, for this so-called affair. It's called, by the way, the Haymarket Affair because it occurred in Haymarket Square in Chicago. Anyway, it caused a lot of people afterwards to kind of turn against the labor movement. They didn't trust it right away. And so that was kind of a problem. It would take years, for people and I guess the government to kind of support the idea, of having these, organized labor unions in companies, of course, where corporations would be obviously, kind of, didn't trust them either. They also had the AFL. That, of course, if you study about American history when it comes to, labor and general labor organizations or whatever, the AFL was considered to be one of the first major ones that organizes that's around for a long time. Now called the AFL-CIO. And it was founded by this Dutch Jewish man named Samuel Gompers, who came from England, came over to America in the 1800s, and he founded the National Federation of Labor in 1886. It was actually founded in Ohio, Columbus, Ohio to be exact. And one thing that's different about his, union, if you know about it, was they began to organize workers based on their craft guild. That should be guild, by the way, where they began to basically divide workers up into whatever their craft is. So basically, if they're like a blacksmith, they would be all unionized with blacksmiths. If they were a steel worker or whatever, iron molder, probably, I guess, or whatever, pipe fitter, that's what they would be organized as. Plumbers, whatever. So they would organize everybody based on whatever their skill is overall. The AFL was a moderate conservative type union. So they preferred to use walkouts, boycotts, arbitration, things like that, over maybe using kind of strikes or any kind of violence, of course, towards like the companies that they're working for and all that. And over time, what happened to the AFL was that it was merged with the Congress of Industrial Organizations, that you may have heard of, the CIO, which also began to unionize workers on industrial trades, like working for factories, working for like, chemical plants and things like that, plants or whatever. They began to organize people like that. But that wasn't found until 1935 by John L. Lewis, who also, by the way, had been involved in the United Mine Workers Union, 1935. So the AFL is important. They also, force a lot of employers to move towards the 8-hour workday in general, and also forcing companies to give employees health insurance, workers' compensation, things like that. And that's something unions are going to, be doing more or less, and forcing companies and corporations to do that later. Then they have, of course, they're, of course, more on the AFL if you want to look at it later with that. So they have, like, obviously a lot of members, over 1 million members by the early 1900s that you can see. Now, you had also the IWW, which, of course, is the International Workers of the World. They're also very famous as a type of organized union. And, of course, this particular union was a socialist one, is what they're kind of known for. And it was the idea of like one big union for all workers, no matter what race, sex, skilled, unskilled, basically they're kind of like the Knights of Labor, kind of similar to it, but more, I guess, of a socialist slant to it. And it was founded in 1905 by William Big Bill Haywood. And they began to organize everybody, even like, say, African Americans, trying to organize them. And you can see there that they were obviously against the capitalist system. Some of their goals, of course, is to overthrow capitalism, replace it with a more socialist type economy. And they're still around. The IWW, I don't know if there's as many people that are probably in it, but there are still people that are in, of course, the International Workers of the World. They had a kind of a bad name. A lot of people, of course, would call them Wobblies, of course. I don't know if you know much about why they called them that, but the name Wobbly was used because of the fact that they would kind of wobble when it came to working. So they tend to like use strikes in general to get whatever they want. And so sometimes employers weren't really sure if they would work or not. Because the joke about IWW was that it really meant I won't work. There was also this joke I remember hearing about years ago, which is famous, but there was a joke where a bunch of, there was like something to the restaurant, like a Chinese restaurant, and there was a Chinese guy that would give them a discount if they were part of this union, IWW, the Wobblies. And of course, he couldn't speak English well. He would say, "Are you with I Wobble Wobble?" Instead of saying IWW, he would say I Wobble Wobble. And so I think that's where the term wobbly came from, was from that joke. But I think it's like a made-up story, maybe. Eugene Debs was also kind of instrumental. He was with the IWW as well. He was involved in unions. He founded the American Railway Union. He was also involved in a lot of strikes also as well. And Debs, he and Haywood were the ones that kind of helped to develop the IWW. But he was a big member of the Socialist Party of America. Was also an American politician. He ran numerous times for the presidency. I think 4 times that Debs actually ran for president with, I think, I want to say, 5 times he ran at one point. 1912, he got 6% of the vote, close to 1 million votes that voted for a socialist, probably the most in American history overall. But socialism, its big heyday was around World One or right before World War One, but socialism is just not a popular thing today. Even if Bernie Sanders was running, I still think people wouldn't really want it, more or less. So anyway, that's just some stuff, of course, but some of the early unions that were founded in American history, they were all part of, like I said, the age of industry and capitalism is kind of starting to kind of develop early on in the late 19th century, I guess. So that's pretty much it for lecture-wise today. I'm going to, of course, move on later in the week on Friday. Of course, I will be talking about the rise of like organized farmers, the populist movement. I'll talk about progressivism as well, which becomes very popular. If I have any time, I might get into talking about the rise of imperialism in the United States, which starts in the late 19th century. So that's it for today. I did want to remind you, don't forget, I did put up a new assignment for you, which is on the Gilded Age. That assignment will be due next week. So see quizzes for that. That's on the 2 previous lectures I had on the Gilded Age, dealing with corruption and politics in the late 19th century. And then, of course, the history of the Old West I did the other day. And then don't forget the Reconstruction quiz is also due later. I think at the end of the week, maybe Friday or Saturday. I probably might push it back a little bit. That assignment is still, of course, up in quizzes. So I'll see you later in the week, Friday, which I'll, of course, move on. And that's it for today. Y'all have a great day. I guess nobody else had any questions, look like it. But if you have any questions, comments about this lecture, let me know, of course, later. You can always, of course, leave a comment question on my channel. If you got an administrative question, of course, about, of course, the lecture, let me know also as well. So y'all take care and have a great rest of the week. So take care.